About 9 million Americans receive some form of counseling or psychotherapy every year. According to an APA study by esteemed psychologist and researcher Dr. Martin Seligman, 87 to 92% get benefit from therapy, depending on the severity of their problem. And that would be from either psychiatrists, psychologists, or clinical social workers. But occasionally, some therapists do unethical, inappropriate, or reckless things. They step over the line and they get in trouble. They get sanctioned, they get fined, or they lose their license to practice. With us to discuss why, how frequently, and in what manner this professional misconduct occurs and what licensing agencies do to discipline these therapists is Jack Zweig. Jack is an attorney, and for over 30 years he's prosecuted disciplinary actions against licensed healthcare professionals for the state agencies in Wisconsin that license them. That includes psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and marriage and family counselors. He recently retired from this role, but he has been a frequent national speaker on professional misconduct, and now he consults with defense attorneys in these cases. Jack, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Dick.
Can you give us some idea how often this happens? What percentage of healthcare professionals in this field do get in trouble?
Yes, my experience, of course, is limited to Wisconsin, but from looking at the literature, going to the national conferences, I think that Wisconsin's experience is pretty average across the country. Here in Wisconsin, if we add up all the psychotherapists we have, psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, there's about 9,000 of them.
Okay.
And I went and looked at the numbers of disciplinary orders or disciplines that have been imposed by the various Wisconsin licensing agencies over the past 4 years. And really, it's a pretty small number. It's less than 0.5% of all the licensees each year.
Okay. So it's not saying, hey, this is an area where you got to be careful in particular.
No, it isn't. Most, as I found from my 30 years of working with these folks, most psychotherapists are good people doing good work. But there are a few who, for various reasons, aren't. And when our agency became aware of them, we tried to find a way to either stop them from practicing or get them to practice better.
How do you find out their misconduct?
Well, complaints come from many different sources, probably the most from patients and clients themselves. They're the ones who feel something has gone wrong in their therapy. But many times, and depending on the kind of the complaint, many times it's a spouse, a family member, mother, father, or because there's something about that therapy that's impacting on the relationship in the family.
How do they even know where to call?
The agencies do not publish their number. In the state certified mental health facilities, there is a requirement that there be a post of where someone can complain about things that have happened. But the actual licensing agencies, people just have to know.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you just have to keep inquiring and you find it.
Yeah, I think nowadays, of course, with the internet, you can just do a search and it pops right up there.
Before we get into the who, how, and what happens, what do the licensing agencies do with misconduct? What's their power and what's their role?
Sure. In some respects, it's easiest to define it by what they don't do.
Okay.
And what they don't do is put anybody in prison, and they don't recover money for the person who may have been harmed by the psychotherapist. That's the role of the criminal justice system and of the civil malpractice system. What the licensing boards do is have an impact on that license that they issue. They have several things they can do as discipline. They can do a public reprimand, which is simply a statement that the person has done wrong.
Who would ever see that besides you guys?
The good question. For many years, no one. But the agency does or at least did, issue a monthly press release with all of the orders in it from all of the licensing boards. That was sent out to the media, and then the media would choose whether to write a story about it depending on whether it was interesting or not, and depending upon whether it involved someone in their specific area. Secondly, it's also available on the department's website. Anyone can go there, they can look up a licensee's name and check and see whether some discipline has been taken.
This is interesting. So wherever people are, say they're in Arizona or New York State, is this kind of a national trend where you can look up the therapist you're about to see and see if they've done anything that got them in trouble like this?
You know, it's not universal. Because I can tell you that many times I was trying to look up a therapist in another state, and there was no way to do it except call and indicate that I was a prosecutor with the Wisconsin board, and I could sometimes then find information that wasn't available to other people.
This would be a good idea, you think, if there was such a thing?
I think every state should have a website in which the citizens of that state, the clients of these psychotherapists, can plug in the person's name and find out if there's ever been a problem with it.
Well, you work also with doctors and so on, but so I would assume this would be true not just psychotherapists, but you would advocate this for physicians as well, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would. And again, it's inconsistent through the states. This is licensure of professionals is a state thing, not a federal thing.
Right.
And so each state approaches it a little differently.
Is Wisconsin very different from other states, or is it
there was a time years ago where Wisconsin was on the forefront of progressive initiatives on licensing. I think now that we've kind of fallen back to the middle of the pack.
Okay, so what is the most likely reason someone's called before you?
Well, I was a little surprised when I went back and looked at these orders over the last 4 years that sexual misconduct with clients remains a very big cause for discipline.
Why does that surprise you?
I would have thought by now people would have gotten it.
This has been true forever, right? That's the main reason? Sexual misconduct?
It's certainly the main reason for severe disciplines. I started to talk about what the boards can do, and I talked about a reprimand, which is the lightest discipline. But they also can suspend a license for either a specific period of time or until some event takes place, such as the person getting education or a mentoring system being put in place. Or they can revoke a person's license, which has the sound and meaning of permanence. But a person whose license is revoked can make application to have it reinstated at a later time, and if they can show that there's really no danger to the public, it happens.
How does the sexual misconduct happen? What's a outline of how this occurs?
Well, it's been described as a slippery slope. The practitioner engaging in boundary crossings, and boundaries for those people that are not in the profession, there are certain expectations of what a professional does. And then there's certain expectations of what other people do in a relationship, family, friends, lovers. And when the professional starts doing things that are outside the norm for a professional, they start to become boundary crossings. And if they are serious enough, and if they can have negative implications, then they're labeled boundary violations.
Wait a minute, you say if they can have negative implications. Is it possible that a therapist can have sex with his ongoing client and that doesn't have negative implications?
No. The sex itself is clear. It's never okay. But how they get to the sex.
Well, how do they get to it?
Well, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
They might start with excessive self-disclosure. As a therapist, part of being a therapist, as I understand it as a lawyer, sometimes a little self-disclosure can be helpful to the therapy. But if there's excessive, and it's kind of a subjective thing here. What is excessive? Well, telling your client that you're having marital problems and you're lonely, that's probably excessive excessive self-disclosure. And then...
And that creates an intimacy, or the client feels You're not just the therapist, you're a friend who discloses.
Absolutely. And can start the dynamics here of transference and countertransference where the client starts looking at the therapist as someone else than a therapist, and the therapist starts looking at the client as someone else than a client.
Okay, so self-disclosure, too much of that.
Yeah,
what
and
other kinds of
well,
things?
another thing is, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, but doing too much for the client, making special things for the client, such as, a good example of that.
Cooking something for them?
Well, yeah, bringing presents. And sometimes the presents are in the shape of a food item, baking a cake, bringing it for them. Again, do you congratulate somebody on their birthday? Sure, why not?
Yeah.
But when you start giving gifts, again, the nature of the relationship begins to change.
Yeah.
And
it's funny, that seems so obvious to me that you wouldn't do that.
It does seem obvious, and yet that's why I say I'm surprised this is still going on, because my goodness, we've done so much education on it, and when we started looking at this back in the mid-1980s, we really cracked people pretty hard when we caught them, because first of all, sex with a client is often incredibly hard to prove because there's only a couple people in the room at the time. So unless there's some other kind of trail to prove it, you can often have one person's word against the other.
How could you prove it?
Well, we've done it through several different ways. One, there usually is some kind of outside trail, whether it's letters and cards that have been kept, now emails. My goodness, the emails we've seen. And oftentimes there's more than one client who's been victimized.
Yeah,
and
several clients.
And that's a big thing. I mean, it's easy to say for a therapist, this client is lying. She's a borderline personality disorder. You can't trust what she is saying. They're mad at me because I wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to do that when there's two of them.
And you have to prove it to take away a license.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a constitutional right involved here in possession of the license. The licensing board can't just say, we think you're a bad person, we're not going to let you have your license. It has to be proven. The standard here in Wisconsin is the same as the standard for a civil case. It's preponderance of the evidence, which means more likely than not. And back when I started, it was actually clear and convincing evidence was the standard. But in order to make it a little easier to do these disciplines, the legislature back in the 80s changed it from clear and convincing to preponderance.
Is it always a man that's the perpetrator?
No, it's not. Again, looking back over the last 4 years' disciplines, it was pretty even, actually. Female therapists were just as likely to become involved with clients as male therapists. And that surprised me a little, because back when I started doing this, that wasn't the case. But again, we're looking at cases in which a client has complained. And, you know, there are some people out there, some males, who would say if a male client, if his female therapist had sex with him, he wasn't victimized, he was lucky. Yeah. And so I think there is still a hesitancy for a male client to make that complaint.
And if that's true, it would sound like, and you're getting 50-50, it sounds like you could imply that probably more women therapists are doing it from that.
That's certainly a possibility.
Do you? I don't know if you're old enough to remember, and you probably are because you're close to my age. There was a day in therapy when sometimes people thought, "Oh, sex with a therapist, that helps a person get comfortable with sex," or things like that. Back in the 60s and 70s. That
was back in the 60s and early 70s. You're right.
Yeah.
I started doing this work in 1980, so that was pretty well behind at that time. But yes, that was
hard to believe.
Yeah. The Esalen Institute out in California, I think may have been one of them, if I remember right.
So the progress of how this happens is, you're saying first it's boundary violations, self-revealing, gifts. Wouldn't a client, if the therapist starts being physical, know this isn't what's supposed to happen?
Well, one would think so. Again, just as the therapist certainly knows it's not supposed to happen,
Yeah.
the client knows that's not what they're there for. But there is this healer and patient relationship, and the way people think about it. The old Florence Nightingale effect, and that's just in healthcare. Once you start bringing in all the dynamics of psychotherapy, that person who may have low self-esteem, that client,
Mm-hmm.
it has someone listening intently to him or her, telling them they're a decent person, and more than a decent person, and they may not be hearing that in their life. And so
It's very seductive.
it's very seductive, and that's what it is here. Even
Makes
I
sense.
hesitated
Makes
to
sense.
use the word seduction because it seems to show intent on the part of the therapist to take that relationship there, and certainly there are some that's true of. But for most, I really think it is something that slowly comes along, and before they know it, they're engaged in this conduct.
So the therapist is enamored with the patient, or what?
Well, oft times, yes, oft times. Sometimes, and really not as often as I thought I would find, it is a predatory therapist, someone who does this repeatedly, someone who you may find has a severe narcissistic personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the people we looked at, and one of the things we did was after we were just revoking licenses for this kind of conduct, we decided, and looking at this, not everybody's doing this for the same reason, and different disciplinary sanctions are appropriate for different people. So we started using an evaluation. There were two psychologists, they're still up there, in Minnesota, Gary Schoner and John Gonziorek, who put together a model of evaluation. It was more than just a typical psychological evaluation. That would be part of it, because you'd want to find if there was psychopathology that needed to be either treated or couldn't be treated, and that person should never come back into practice. But their evaluation method also involved talking to third parties, talking to the client, him or herself, to get their perspective of what happened, because you really don't know what happened unless you've talked to them. And even two people seeing the same event see it differently. And so that was part of it. They also would talk to spouses or significant others, because what was going on in the therapist's home life could also have an impact on why they were doing what they were doing and whether they're safe to practice. And they'd also talk, if possible, to colleagues to see what were they seeing in the clinic. And then they'd put all that together and come up with a theory as to why the person did what they did. And once you know why they did it, then you can put together what you should do about it. Should you prohibit this person from ever practicing again? Should you require them to take some education? I mean, some folks really are unclear on what boundaries are appropriate. For some, they need psychotherapy, and for some, they need something closer consultation in the clinic with a colleague.
How can the testimony of the patient change your view on what happened?
Well, many therapists, when we interview them, those that would admit to the conduct, would say that the patient was seductive. The patient wanted this. It didn't matter. It was still a violation.
Yeah.
But in trying to determine what you did with the person, it did matter. And so by asking the patient, you would at least get the patient's viewpoint. And seldom was it the same as the therapist's viewpoint. And so was the therapist lying when he or she said the patient really was the driving force here? may have been lying, but may also just have been minimizing, diminishing, and rationalizing.
The pathology of the and perpetrators, I don't know if that's the right word here, but the therapist is in trouble. One you said could be narcissistic personality disorder when they have serial events.
Correct.
What are the other makeups of therapists who do this when you do a psychological profile?
Well, sometimes they would find that they were inadequately trained. Sometimes
they didn't know this was not okay?
Well, they knew sex with a patient or client was not okay, but they weren't appropriately trained to stop before they got on the slippery slope.
I see.
Yeah.
Things with boundaries and self-revealing and so on.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Others just didn't have good supervision. Oftentimes I'd find it was a sole practitioner who really had nobody to talk to about it. Because when I talked to groups of therapists, and they'd say, well, what can I do to avoid trouble? And I'd say, well, first of all, the first test is don't do something you wouldn't do if your mother was watching. And then I would say, well, you need to get consultation with someone and tell them what you're thinking of doing, why you're thinking of doing it, and what you think the impact will be. And when you do that, don't choose somebody that you think is going to agree with you, because then there's no point in doing it. Find someone, in fact, that you think might disagree with you. And there's the advantage just saying something out loud sometimes.
You bet.
As soon as you've said it, you say, this is not a good idea.
Well, let's say you find, okay, this therapist wasn't narcissistic, just didn't get the proper etiquette or rules of boundaries, and he's now going to get educated in that. Would he ever not get suspended for a period of time if he had intercourse with a patient?
I believe the answer to that is no.
Okay.
Every psychotherapist who has had, and it doesn't have to be intercourse, sexual contact with a patient would be suspended. At least that's the way it was when I was doing these cases, and I was the one doing them all. And from what I've looked at in the more recent cases since I retired, it's still that way. There's a little difference with healthcare providers who are not providing psychotherapy. In some cases they'll be suspended, but the suspension will be stayed while they're monitored and educated and supervised. But because of the dynamic of psychotherapy, we always took the position that there had to be a whack at the beginning, that is, a suspension.
Okay. Any other, before we move on to other areas that get therapists in trouble besides sexuality, is there any other personality type that pops up that may have had this boundary issue with sex?
Yeah. There are people who have an excessive need for client approval. People who are emotionally needy and dependent. And with them, it may be characterological rather than pathological, and it may be something that really is almost impossible to treat.
In which case you suspend for indefinitely.
In which case that would be the appropriate thing to do, because you really can't trust them to come back into practice and not reoffend.
Well, what if they get psychotherapy?
These particular characterological traits are difficult to solve with psychotherapy.
These are needy, insecure people.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people go to therapy because they're needy and insecure.
Yeah, but there's a level. There's a level, Dick. There's a spectrum, let's say.
So this is severe.
Yeah. Now, what you might do with someone like that is require that they be in a very closely supervised practice with someone who's pulling charts, reviewing the charts, discussing things with them, and occasionally interviewing clients and patients, because the person writing in the chart is the practitioner, not the patient.
From what you're saying, I would suspect that there's more risk when people are practicing out alone somewhere without any colleagues of this happening.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct.
No data on that, but that's just your sense.
Anecdotally, from my experience of doing this work with with psychotherapists for more than 20 years, I'd say yes. Yeah.
Okay. Outside of this issue around sex, what is the second, third most frequent reasons for these
Probably
hearings?
the second most are dual relationships of other kinds. People, there was recently an order where a psychotherapist had gotten into business with his client.
Oh.
I mean, had invested more than $100,000 in a business with a client.
My goodness.
From your reaction, Dick, I think you think that's probably wrong.
Yes.
Yeah. It clearly was, although he continued to say there was nothing wrong with it.
Oh,
and this was a
really?
long-term client who remained in therapy during the time the business was going forward. The business, as many businesses did over the last 10 years, had some significant financial problems, causing the client more stress, more anxiety. And who was he to talk to about that stress and anxiety?
Sure.
The therapist, who was a little miffed that he was losing his money.
Yeah, so the dual role means you're not a clean therapist coming to the case
Right.
just for the benefit of the client.
I think that the ways we describe it are that it either creates a conflict of interest for the psychotherapist,
Right.
or it impacts on their ability to do what needs to be
Of
done.
course. What about the damage to clients from these kind of things? Let's go back to the sexual offense. What are the damage to clients?
Well, I've heard many expert witnesses describe the damage done to clients. The first thing I think of is it makes it very, very difficult for that client to see another therapist.
Yeah.
I think that is the most significant. Although almost equally significant is the fact that how much good work was being done with that client by the therapist
Right.
during the lead up to and while the sexual relationship took place.
I thought we were moving from this subject, but
Yeah,
quick
sorry.
question. The serial offender,
Yeah.
do they ever get a license again?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
I'm surprised.
I'm thinking of a psychiatrist who he gave up his license. We call them voluntary surrenders. When we've got them in a full Nelson and they're about to lose their license, and then they surrender them. It's a way to save our resources, but all the facts are in the document, so anyone reading it knows what they've done. There was a psychiatrist here in Madison years ago who, in fact, a couple of them, who had sex with more than one client, and after several years, and then after more years of practicing under a limited license, in which first they were both men. First they were not able to see female patients, and then they were able to see certain female patients, and but it was all under a very close monitoring system. And ultimately, they both got their full licenses back, and as far as we know, have never reoffended.
Okay. So back to the dual relationships. Is barter part of this? A client has no money but says, hey, I do massage, or I can fix your house, or whatever.
Yeah, barter is another one of those things that I would put in a category of sometimes it may be okay.
Like when?
Well, there's really like three columns you could put things in. One is it's never okay, and that's having sex with a patient. The next is sometimes, and the other is always okay. And when you go to presentations done on ethics and things are thrown out as that are always okay, there's usually somebody that can come up with an example where it's not.
Yeah.
One of the things is hugs, of course. Is a hug okay? And some people would say never okay, some people would say always okay, and others would say, what kind of hug are we talking about here?
Right.
And that really is what determines it. And as a lawyer, I can't make these decisions. I would always have to consult with a professional in that profession and say, okay, what's the standard of care here?
Yeah.
What is allowed, what isn't allowed?
But the barter.
You raised barter.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking about barter as in the client providing labor to the therapist, I can't think of a specific incident where we have said that was okay. If they're bringing in chickens as payment, that's barter too.
Yeah.
I think, but the reason the employment situation is not allowed is again because it sets up a different kind of relationship, and for the social workers, marriage and family therapists, professional counselors, their rules specifically say you cannot provide psychotherapy to an employee. And so if and they're not using the standards that would be used by the state as what is a contractor, what is an employee. If somebody's providing you services, they would be considered to be an employee. And so barter would not be allowed.
Okay, so I'm hearing dual role, sexuality, and boundaries. Is that part of this, or is that a separate category?
Boundaries are dual relationships are involve most of the boundary things that I can think of.
Is there any area we've neglected here?
Well, there are just people that are criminal. There are people who do billing fraud.
Well, sure.
And usually that'll result in a criminal conviction, and then the board will just look at that conviction. But sometimes, because criminal convictions require evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, and the licensing board only needs preponderance of the evidence, sometimes we could prove fraud where they couldn't in a criminal case. There's also false advertising.
What would that sound like?
Yeah, boy, I'm trying to... We had a licensed professional counselor who had a sign out front that said he was a licensed psychologist. That's false advertising.
Yeah. We'll fix you in 2 sessions, guaranteed, or something?
Well, that would be. That definitely would be. I've never seen that. People are not...
Well, in closing, as we're kind of running out of time, what, if anything, should tip off a patient that this might be something you should run away from or report?
I think the first thing would be if the psychotherapist said you shouldn't tell anybody else about whatever it is. Obviously there's confidentiality in a psychotherapeutic relationship, but that is the psychotherapist has to maintain the confidentiality. Right. When the therapist is asking the patient to keep something confidential, I'd say that's an alarm. Yeah. Otherwise, if something just doesn't feel right, I think patients have a pretty good feel for that. And if it doesn't feel right, talk to somebody about it. As I said, a lot of these clinics have brochures that you can contact somebody and ask them about it. Or ask the clinician that you're seeing if you can talk to somebody else in the clinic.
Well, Jack Zweig, I thank you very much. This has been very illuminating. I'm glad to hear it's a very infrequent thing, but interesting to hear what goes on. And I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights. And remember, you can find all our podcasts at dickgoldbergradio.com or search for Dick Goldberg at iTunes or YouTube.